This episode is sponsored by Romanwell. Does your Google search contain something along the lines of, what can I eat with IBD? Are you stressing about how to navigate food choices at an upcoming wedding, family vacation, or graduation party? Don't worry. The IBD dietitians at Romanwell have got you covered. They're here to help you safely expand your diet and build your confidence in food selection by providing the one-on-one support and tools you need to navigate nutrition through all of life's phases. Go to romanwell.com to apply for a free consultation so you can start feeling and living well.
Hi, I'm Alicia.
And I'm Robin, and you're listening to Bowel Moments,
the podcast sharing real talk about the realities of IBD. Served on the rocks. Guys, today's episode is so exciting. We have IBD advocate extraordinaire, Tina Aswani Omprakash. We had such a great conversation with her and talked about so many things. So this is a supersized episode today. We talked to her about cultural stigma. We talked to her about her very complicated case of Crohn's disease. We talked to her about her new organization, the South Asian IBD Alliance. We talked to her about pelvic floor physical therapy. We talked to her about acupuncture and so many more things. You're going to love it. Cheers.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Bowel Moments. This is Robin.
Hey, guys. This is Alicia. And I am really excited to have our guest join us today. Tina Aswani Omprakash is kind of a phenom in our IBD world. So I think
it's a big deal.
Kind of a big deal. Yes. So we're really delighted to have you join us and excited. So welcome, Tina. We are very happy to hear more of your story. Your story is quite public already, but I'm excited to hear it straight from your mouth. But we are going to start out, before you tell us that story, asking you the very boring question of, what are you drinking?
I am drinking water with Miralax mixed into it. That is unfortunately my dinner time ritual, given the fact that I have motility problems as a result of bowel obstructions and scar tissue, but more so lately, it's Ehlers-Danlos of the gut. Gosh. I have been diagnosed with that. So just to keep things moving, it helps to take some Miralax throughout the day.
Does it mix well with wine? Because that's what I'm drinking. So I don't know, maybe I'll just stir in a little bit every evening.
Sprinkle it in, Alicia.
A little sprinkle, just a little flavor for the wine. Oh, goodness.
What kind of wine?
I am drinking.
What kind of wine?
Oh gosh, what am I drinking? I'm drinking a Cab, and I think it's a 2017. I don't know. It's from the Frias family vineyard. What are you drinking, Robin?
Nice. Cider.
We kind of fell back on our old ways today, didn't we? Wine for me and cider for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so Tina, please tell us your IBD story.
Sure. First and foremost, I just want to thank you both for having me here today. It's an honor to be a part of this and to be able to serve the IBD community in a way that can help people feel more comfortable with their disease. So my IBD journey is unfortunately a long and windy one, but I can start from the beginning, where I was diagnosed with actually ulcerative colitis in the beginning in 2006 when I was 22. And it wasn't really because I was having symptoms. It was more that it runs in my family. My symptoms were more like constipation and GERD throughout my teens. And even as a young child, I had a lot of constipation. Like, it wasn't typical, like what you consider to be IBD symptoms. Mm-hmm. So I actually saw my PCP and I was like, look, I have health insurance now, which I didn't have as a child, most of my childhood. There was no ACA back then. And my father had died when I was 8. So of Crohn's turned colorectal cancer. So really, my family was struggling financially, and insurance is not something we could afford. So here I am, graduated from college, and I'm like, you know what? I need to get a colonoscopy because my father was diagnosed so young. The one thing I knew is this could be hereditary. So I was diagnosed in January 2006 with ulcerative colitis, but I didn't actually have my first flare until June 2006. Bloody diarrhea, abdominal pain. And from there on out, I think I really struggled to find a doctor. As I think both of you know, the community may or may not know, it's very hard to find somebody who's IBD aware or specialized, right? So that was actually a challenge. I went through several doctors until I landed on one in the city, in New York City, which is where I live now. But back then I lived in New Jersey. And in New Jersey, there really wasn't anybody specialized at the time, about 16 years ago. And that was a real challenge to find somebody who really understood IBD and wasn't trying to keep putting me on prednisone, because I didn't want to be on prednisone. I was like, you got to give me something else for management. I'm not like terribly sick here that you need to put me on prednisone. So they actually started me on 5 ASAs. For the first couple of years, I would have flare-ups on and off. We would use enema, suppositories, laboratories and I'd be fine. Come 2008, I had gone for my 24th birthday to Cancun with my now husband. He was my boyfriend at the time. And that was like late 2007. And I came back with really bad gastroenteritis. He did too, but he threw it all up. Me, I wasn't throwing it up. I was just really sick for like a week. And my doctor's like, I don't know what's going on. We're going to put you on antibiotics. Put me on antibiotics. Lo and behold, I had pretty massive flare up the next month, December 2007. After that, it was just downhill. I developed C. diff in January 2008. And for those of you who may not know what C. diff is, it's like spores in your intestines that form from basically your gut bacteria being killed off. So antibiotics killed off my gut bacteria, and here I was with C. diff. And patients with IBD are at greater risk for C. diff, according to studies. So once I developed the C. diff, that was it. It was basically, I was headed for surgery at that point. And they told me, we need to move you from 5-ASAs up to Remicade. And I'm like, what? What's Remicade? So here I am like, oh my God, what is this Remicade? Why is this an infusion? And I'm so young. How do I need this? And I didn't know a single person in the IBD community other than my father, who had passed away many years ago, my aunt many years ago in India. So I'm like, this is crazy. I asked my boyfriend for help. I asked my mom. My mom was like, oh no, I need to reach out to extended family about this. This is a really big deal. This is a family decision. And, you see warning labels of lymphoma and this and that, all sorts of scary side effects. And she's like, you cannot go on this at the age of 24. Like, what is this? This is worse than what your dad was on, which was prednisone for 15 years. I'm like, have our drugs not advanced? Like, I had no knowledge whatsoever. My family didn't either. And so you would think we would, but we didn't. And everybody was just like, this is a diet disease. You did this to yourself. You probably drank too much in college. It was just awful. Like, as if I was not dealing with shitting my brains out like 40 times a day. There were people telling me I did this to myself, and that, I have to do naturopathy and homeopathy and Ayurveda, all these ancient traditional types of medicine to cure myself. And, biologics are a failure. And I'm like, a failure of what? Failure of me being able to take care of myself. That's how much I was shamed. And when I say the cultural stigma was too much to handle, it was backbreaking for me. Like, honestly, if this disease was not bad enough, I literally felt like a horrible human being if I spoke to anybody about my disease. There was no support structures. There was no social media with people talking about IBD, destigmatizing it. I thought I did this to myself and that I was at fault, and I was all alone and isolated from my friends. I had moved back in with my mom in New Jersey instead of working in the city and being with my friends. Honestly, it just felt like my life had turned upside down. I had like a stellar career going for me, and I lost it all, right? Like a blink of the eye, like I lost it all. And it was really terrifying at the age of 24. And I was on the brink of losing my boyfriend, who's now my husband. But, even his family was like, what are you doing with that sick woman? Like, you can do so much better. Like, you can find somebody in India or here or wherever. Like, you don't need to deal with this. And so that's the other thing, like, not to put my culture down because I love my culture, but honestly, the ableism is something that runs deep in many cultures, especially in traditional societies. Marriageability is considered something of the fit, the physically and emotionally fit. It's not for somebody who's diseased like me, supposedly. It was really like my entire life had like a rug pulled from underneath it. So at 24, I decided to finally try Remicade. This was 3 months in. It was against my family's wishes, but I had lost so much weight. The Remicade worked for a week. It was too late for it to work, honestly. And it worked for a week, and it was like a miracle. Like, I had formed stool, no blood for like a week, and then right back down again. I ended up in surgery. Again, lots of pushback on this. It took another 2 months for me to have surgery. And my doctor was like, time is of the essence. My normal is about 135 pounds. I was 85 pounds and I'm 5'6".
Oh my gosh.
My surgeon told me, Tina, I'm not sure you're going to survive this surgery. And mind you, my surgeon was Asian at the time. He understood the taboos and stigmas. He was very patient with my mom and me. And he got me in for emergency surgery on the 4th of July in 2008. It was Independence Day. And so it was very dramatic, my story. And it didn't end there, unfortunately. It's been a long road since. Long story short, even after that, the recovery was very difficult. I had C. diff multiple times after that. I didn't even have a colon, and I was being fed by TPN on exclusive enteral nutrition for some time, getting off the TPN and then onto food. It was very challenging, but I'm grateful that, I survived that and that there was an option for me to survive. I just wish that there wasn't so much cultural stigma involved in all of that. The next several years were quite challenging. That was probably the most dramatic part of my story. After that, I kept needing surgery, to be honest with you. I ended up going for a J pouch, again, due to cultural stigma. My mom's like, this guy's not going to marry you with an ostomy, even though he said he was fine with it. His family was against my ostomy, so I reversed. I went to a J pouch, and for me, that was the beginning of the end. For listeners, J pouches can be life-saving for true ulcerative colitis patients. For somebody who actually has Crohn's, which wasn't diagnosed for another 3 years after that, it can be like what felt like a death sentence to me. The J pouch got inflamed. It was inflamed even before takedown. They thought it was pouchitis. It turned into chronic refractory pouchitis, and I alternated antibiotics for 6 years. And it felt like shards were coming out of my bottom. I was bleeding. It was just incomplete evacuation. And come a few years into my J pouch journey, I developed something called a fistula. And for those of you listening, a fistula is like an abnormal tunnel that breaks through the intestine into another organ or out onto the skin. It's due to significant inflammation. So the intestine kind of ruptures at that point because of all the inflammation. And this was my first fistula. I had been married for about a year, and it was a rectovaginal fistula. So basically from the site of my J pouch, where it had been connected to the rectal cuff, there was a fistula right into my vagina. And it was awful. Awful is like the understatement of the year. 28 years old, and I have poop coming out of my lady parts and mucus and blood, and it's vile and disgusting. And I think that, oh my God, what is this disease doing to me? Why does it keep coming back and driving me insane? And like, why can't my body just love me back, instead of betraying me all the time? So that was really challenging. I developed 5 more fistulae after that. We tried biologics. We retried Remicade, tried Humira, tried Entyvio, which had just come on the market at the time in 2014, just got FDA approved. Nothing worked. We even tried tacrolimus suppositories, anything and everything to try to get this under control. Low dose naltrexone, they were trying everything. The problem was no medication was working for me. It turned out that, we decided that I need to have my J pouch excised. Initially, we tried a diversion surgery in 2012 where they gave me a temporary loop ileostomy and disconnected my J pouch to allow it to heal. It didn't work. After that, within a couple of years, they're like, this thing's got to come out. So it came out. And I thought, okay, I'm finally done. No. I had my surgery in December 2014 to remove my J pouch. And here we are, Christmas time, and I'm having abscesses galore in there. I'm vomiting, I'm not feeling well at all, running temperatures, admitted back in the hospital. I had in 2015 7 surgeries trying to correct this. There were bits and pieces of J pouch and rectum left inside that were developing abscesses because the Crohn's was still running rampant. So my pelvis had an abscess that was 9 centimeters long, and it was like a honeycomb. They couldn't break through it. And I went to Cleveland Clinic, then I went to Mayo Clinic. Cleveland offered me that they would re-excise everything a few times, and then with plastic surgery, take the gracilis flap behind my thigh, take a flap from there and fill it in. There was a 74% success rate, and there was a chance that my Crohn's would attack again. And I was like, that's not good enough for me. I've been through too much. And at this point, they told me that massive pelvic abscess I had a fistula coming out of it headed for my spine. So that meant potentially paralysis if it broke through. And I was like, I need to get another opinion. And I said, I'm going to go to the Mayo Clinic. So I went to the top doctor at the Mayo Clinic, and he took care of me, and he called the surgeon in right away. And he was like their colorectal trauma guy. He's like, I'm taking you in for surgery tomorrow. And I still remember the fellow being like, but you look really good. And I'm like, really, are you really going to say that to me right now? That was July of 2015. So exactly 7 years ago, I was taken in the next morning, and he's like, I'm going to try to stick a drain into that abscess, see how much we can drain out. What he did was put a drain in that came down my leg onto my thigh and then out down to my ankle. And it was emptying fluid into my ankle, basically a bag on my ankle. So mind you, I had a PICC line, I had an ankle bag with a drain coming out of my bottom, and then I had a bag. So can you imagine how I was sleeping? Like it was so uncomfortable.
I've actually had that too, the drain
Yes.
out of the bottom and the PICC line at the same time, and they're no comfortable position to sleep.
At all, Robin. I'm with you. And then the bag is there too, so it's not like I can sleep on my belly either. So that was the problem. The other problem was when he placed that drain, he said, Tina, I'm sorry, I could not really get up through your bottom because it was so scarred. He made a brand new hole to the side of my bottom, and he stuck the drain through that. And this, I think, was the other dramatic part of my story where that I developed significant post-traumatic stress. They wanted me to inject hydrogen peroxide 3 times a day into my pelvis through that drain. And I did it.
What?
I was suicidal. They made me go home. 3 weeks later, my mom's calling them, and she's like, you need to move the surgery up. My daughter's going to kill herself.
Oh my God.
I used to cry 3 times a day. It was basically to try to get rid of as much of the abscess, dry as much of the abscess out as possible, and disinfect it as much as possible. That's what was explained to me. And she was like, my daughter won't make it another week or 2. You need to move that surgery up. So we flew back to the Mayo Clinic. Thank God my husband had decent insurance. He was paying a fortune for it and still is for out-of-state coverage. And they took me back. I was in the hospital for about 5 or 6 weeks throughout August into September of 2015. And they re-excised that area. So he did it once in July, 2 more times in August, re-excised the area. And after the second time, he put me into a pool of salt water to clean out that wound. I didn't know how large the wound was because I was really out of it. And my husband took some photos because I demanded it. I begged him to take photos because I really wanted to see what was going on with my bottom. It was huge. And my husband was like, how is this ever going to close?
Like,
And
you just held up your hands. I just want to say the circle that you made was about the size of a grapefruit, maybe larger. That's how big.
yeah. And I was horrified. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know if I was going to make it, to be honest with you. And the surgeon reassured me that he has done this once before and it has closed. I was like, once before? He's like, you have a rather small frame. I think it's going to close. We're going to do our best. He attached, after that saltwater pool incident, which was, again, another traumatic incident, like they literally lowered me into a saltwater pool in the hospital. They brought me back, I remember, into my room, and they have single rooms, given the nature of such a massive surgery. I remember waking up to, it's like white walls all around me, and there's a photo of Jesus Christ, I swear. Like, I'm like laying there, and it's like this fuzzy photo of Jesus Christ. I'm like, am I dead? I'm laughing about it, but I was like, oh my God, like, what is this? And it took me a while to realize what was going on. And then I see this woman with like a blue dress sashay in, and it's my mom. And am I dead? Like, what is going on over here? And she's like, no, Tina, you're alive. And like, there's like a gurney that was like lowering me into the actual bed. And I saw the nurses doing that. And I was like, okay, I'm alive, Tina, you're alive.
Oh
it
my
was
God.
such an experience. Mind you, I was 31 years old at the time, and I thought I was dead. And here I am waking up, and they're like, you're going to do a procedure every other day where we will clean out this wound, because they had packed the wound and packed it to the extent that there was a wound vac, like a vacuum inside, trying to suck the pressure out. It was like negative air pressure to suck the pressure out to close it. Mind you, I developed sciatica sitting on that bed like this, off to the side, because it was in the side of my bottom. It was really the most harrowing experience in my life. I'm not going to lie when I say that some people can be very rough with these experiences too. And medical professionals, like, especially on the surgery side, like, I understand, they're extremely skilled and I have a lot of respect for them. But some of those times that I had those procedures, they wanted me to do it without sedation. My mom screamed at them. I screamed at them. Like, you have to put me under. There were times when I felt weak because I needed sedation to go through that procedure. It was a very challenging time in my life for me. And I remember being there for 5 to 6 weeks. The original plan was to discharge me and have me clean this out on my own while staying in the Mayo Clinic vicinity. They're like, well, that's your fault. I mean, that's literally what they said. They're like, that's your fault because you can't do this without sedation. I'm like, you try doing this without sedation. Like, it's such a sensitive area in your body. So yes, my story is very public, but I've definitely never shared the extent of what I went through at the Mayo Clinic that publicly, to be honest with you. After that, I think the GI there was a PI, a primary investigator on a clinical trial for Stelara, and they found another fistula on MRI towards the end of my stay. And I demanded and advocated for myself for another MRI because I was having fistula-like symptoms again. And as I was discharged, they asked me to stay for another week to sort of figure out what to do about this fistula. So at that time, my wound, believe it or not, 6 weeks in, was 3 inches deep. It was so tiny. It was a miracle. And the fact that I had another fistula, I was just like, God, I'm never going to get rid of this disease. Like, it doesn't matter what I do. And at that time, the doctor put me on Stelara. He spoke to my doctor in New York, arranged it at the clinical trial dose. The dose for plaque psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis was, I believe, half or a third of the Stelara dose that I'm taking. And he told me that in his clinical trial experience, that's what he's doing, and he's seeing it work well, because my doctor in New York also had access to off-label Stelara at the psoriasis dosing, at the psoriatic arthritis and plaque psoriasis dosing. And so he specifically talked to my doctor, and he's like, this is what we're going to do. And we are going to get her on this higher dose, and let's see what happens, because we got to try to close this fistula. And I said, why is this fistula even happening if you've gotten rid of my rectum and my colon and my J pouch is completely out? He's like, so I've seen this 2 or 3 times before you, where it's like sort of this disease process trying to continue, even though the organ has been surgically removed. And I was like, what kind of Crohn's disease do I even have? Like, what is this? And I remember him saying that he has seen it a couple times and he's been able to treat it. And I was just so thankful that I was there. So he put me on Stelara. I would say within 3 to 4 months, I saw a response. I needed to do fewer sitz baths. I didn't feel like I had a constant UTI, or it was mostly mucus leaking at this point because there was no stool. I mean, there was no J pouch there or anything. And I had a bag. I had a permanent ileostomy. So that, I would say in 2016, I finally came into remission for the first time in my 10-year journey with inflammatory bowel disease. And it was because they corrected the surgeries and got me on the right drug. And no drug worked before that. That's a huge unmet need, even for our community today. That's why we're seeing so many drugs come out and so many different mechanisms of action for these drugs, because the remission rates are 30 to 40%. And so I'm really grateful that finally got into remission. I never thought it was going to be possible. But like they say, when you fix one leaky pipe, you might find a hole burst in another area, right? So, even though I went into remission, I started to develop significant constipation, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. I developed allergies, sinusitis during this time. I'm going to have sinus surgery in a couple of weeks. And I developed pelvic floor dysfunction. It's not surprising after all these surgeries. And I actually have Sjogren's syndrome as well as autoimmune hepatitis now too, which are much more recent diagnoses. And I mentioned the Ehlers-Danlos of the gut too. I have Ehlers-Danlos type 3. So lots of different diagnoses that all sort of followed this in the last 7 years. So even though my Crohn's has been in remission, I'm dealing with like a mountain of diseases the last 7 years that I'm trying to manage alongside with trying to keep my gut from acting up. I also have gastroparesis, which slows things down and kind of paralyzes the stomach that they think might have happened from having so much surgery. So I just wanted to put out there, remission, it helps and it puts us back on track to get our life back together. I mean, that's the only reason why I've been able to do advocacy work, to do freelance consulting work for various companies and nonprofits, is because I'm in remission now. Otherwise, it was just like, I felt like I was a revolving door in these hospitals. And while I still need a lot of maintenance, treatment, and office visits and stuff, it's a lot better now. But the last several years, I was really struggling with severe blockages and constipation. And I finally had surgery in November. It was very hard for them to find in New York what was going on with me. None of the studies were showing that there were blockages or catching them. And I was on like a boatload of drugs to go to the bathroom, seeing a motility specialist at Columbia and everything. I guess this is fortuitous. I went to Pittsburgh to speak in November, and one of my advocate friends took me to the ER because I had a blockage while I was there. I gave the talk I was supposed to give in Pittsburgh. I told her to hold on and that I would go with her to the ER right after. I did. They admitted me. They said, your bowel's becoming necrotic. There's something going on. We can't see it in imaging, but there's something clearly going on. I finally felt validated that somebody agrees that there's something going on, even though radiology still can't find what's wrong with me on CT or MRI, which is exactly what was happening here in New York. That the doctor came in the next morning. He's like, you're not flying home. Tell your husband to fly here. And he's like, you need surgery right away. And he's like, your bowel's becoming necrotic. He brought the surgeon in, and it was a weekend. They came in first thing in the morning. They're like, look at the side to side image of the CT scan. There are at least 2 or 3 blockages here that we think are happening. And there's something going on in your pelvis that we can't figure out. We need to open you up and see what's going on, because from what you're telling us, you're having these blockages regularly and not absorbing things properly and developing constant small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO. So, and needing to be on rounds of antibiotics for SIBO all the time. So I said, fine. I was honestly sick of banging my head against a wall with regards to, why I was having these obstructions. It's no way to live. It turned out that behind my stoma, the way that my stoma was stapled was a side-to-side staple, which they use to do quick surgery, but actually is not beneficial for certain patients who have Ehlers-Danlos type 3. So my gut tends to expand and hold on to stool. And you need to hand sew bowels that are like that. So they actually went in, took off part of the terminal ileum that had become somewhat necrotic, and they gave me a brand new stoma that actually moves now and things actually come out. And they fixed that and hand sewed it. Then they also went into the pelvis. They're like, what is going on in that region? Because they saw something but couldn't see what it was. They were like, your bladder was tethering itself to the bowel. So they separated that. That was causing necrosis in the bowel too. And they said that I had blood in my urine. That was another reason why they weren't letting me go. And they're like, that was causing the blood in the urine. So they had to separate that. And then there was another site of obstruction in the bowel as well that they had to clear out. And then they also went through and cleared all the scar tissue out. It was 7.5 hour massive laparotomy surgery. And, my surgeon in New York was like, Tina, you really should be having this done in New York. This is massive. And I was like, no, I understand. But look, they found it here. And, I've been suffering with this forever. And I need somebody who actually found it to take care of this. And my friend was like, Tina, you are in some really good hands here at UPMC. I didn't even know they were like this massively acclaimed IBD center, but they are. And I got such good care there, even though I had major complications, which was expected. I had an ileus because of my gastroparesis. So what happens is some patients who've had a lot of surgery can develop something called an ileus, which is basically your bowel stops moving after surgery. And it could take a day or it could take 6 months to clear. Nobody knows. it was really hard with all the narcotics I was on, with gastroparesis, which already causes paralysis in the stomach. They were like, we are going to have to do something about this and we're not sure what. And they were really honest. And I was like, oh my God, what are we going to do about this ileus? And my surgeon in New York had warned me about it. What if you have an ileus for 6 months and you want to be in New York if that something like that happens? And my patient advocate friend held my hand through all of it. I'm giving a shout out to Lori Plum. Okay. My husband and her were there for me the entire time in Pittsburgh. So there is a medication that's used for patients who are on narcotics and get addicted to them. I wasn't addicted to them, to sort of pull them off and get their bowels moving again, because narcotics block things up. So a side benefit of this medication was to free up the bowels. They gave that to me, and they don't usually do that in the hospital. So they had to special order it, and it opened things up. And within a week, I was discharged. I mean, it was an MD, PhD who figured that out over there, who is a fellow. So I'm just going to tell you, like, never discount. There are some of the smartest people around the world who really care about you with this disease and really want you to have quality of life. I've seen some of those doctors since at conferences, at meetings, and, they saved my life. It was a massive complication I had, and they handled it with grace. So, even when you're in remission, these things can happen. I'm just so thankful that things are moving again. Do I still have SIBO because of the slowdown? Yes, I still have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. They can't get rid of that with surgery. So the gut expands, holds onto the stool too much, but it still moves like 100 times better than before. It's not obstructed. So that's the thing with surgery, with medications, that I think people always have to remember is that even though your life may get so much better, it's not perfect. And that's something we have to accept. Is this is our, as people say, our quote unquote new normal way of living. So that's my life in a nutshell, my Crohn's journey, and really just my chronic illness journey over the last several years, over the last 16 and a half years. And I don't know. I just want to say, I'm always really honored to share, because for the longest time, Robin and Alicia, I used to run like a women's support group with the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation here in New York. And for the longest time, I wouldn't share my story. And the reason why I wouldn't is because I didn't want to freak women out. I didn't want to freak them out and think this could happen to them. But the truth is, people need to hear your story and need to hear that everybody has a different story, and that everybody is allowed to have a voice in this process, and that everybody's story matters. And not everybody's story is going to have the same severity or the same drama that mine did.
This episode is sponsored by Well. Have you ever felt overwhelmed and unsure about what questions you should ask your doctor, or if you should get a referral to a dietitian? If so, you are not alone. The dietitians over at Well help patients every day navigate these questions and many more. They've just released an amazing free resource for patients called the IBD Patient Starter Kit that is jam-packed with tips and tools to empower you to become your own best advocate. Check out the show notes or head on over to romanwell.com to download a copy of the IBD Patient Starter Kit today.
We appreciate you sharing that, because you're 100% correct. People need to share their stories, whether they're like our guest, Amy, who's like, I didn't have to have surgery until just recently and everything kind of was okay, to somebody like you who's had all these complications. People need to hear all iterations of this for sure.
One of our guests, Clayton, is coming on the show, and I've known him for 11 years. And we joked just the other day that I've just accepted the fact, and he's just accepted the fact, that our bodies are going to try to kill us every once in a while. And we just have to try to stay alive longer than our body is trying to kill us.
I'm with him, honestly. Like, people always say, how can you be grateful after everything that you've been through? And I'm like, you know what? My father died at my age because there was nothing back then, like literally nothing. He had no biologics at the age of 39 in 1992. And here we are 30 years later. I was 8 when he passed away. Here we are 31 years later, and we have all these medication options. I know they're not perfect, and I'm not going to sit here singing their praises, but they've allowed people to live their lives, go back to careers, spend time with their friends, go on vacation. I will take that as a step forward. It's not perfect. We are far from perfect at this stage, but this is a disease that took people's lives years ago, and it's not doing that anymore. Not to the same extent, at least.
that is a good thing to remind people that we have come very, very far. You talked about culture and how the sort of culture that you're living in definitely factored into some decisions you made and people's responses to you being diagnosed with this and also all your treatment choices. I know you parlayed that into the South Asian IBD Alliance, but that was quite a distance between when you first were diagnosed and here. So talk to us about how did you decide to do this and how did that evolve and what does that mean?
Going into advocacy, just to, be completely honest, was social suicide for me. And I use that term and I don't use it lightly. In 2014, when I was going through considering J-pouch excision surgery, I had joined Twitter. And it was Twitter that I joined to try to learn more about my disease and what was going on, because I was seeing publications by doctors, I was seeing chatter, tutorials, things like that. And I was like, I know so much about my disease. I should be doing this kind of work too. And I remember discussing with my husband, and he's like, oh, no. You know that nobody approves of you in the first place. Like, he didn't say it quite like that, but he's like, we can't deal with another thing. We've had enough thrown at our marriage and on our relationship. And I was like, but there was still this fire inside me that I had to do something, but I was just too sick at the time. 2016 comes around. Now I'm in remission, right? After the surgeries at the Mayo Clinic, et cetera. And again, that voice is going on in my head. Tina, you got to do something. What you went through, first of all, is not normal by any means, not even for an IBD diagnosis. And what you went through may be what other South Asians are going through, because I would hear it for other disease areas, the shame and the blame and the guilt and the stigma, except mine was more accentuated because of the bowel components and because it involved the intestines, which is traditionally associated with, oh, that's a diet disease or a lifestyle disease. So there was already something like just going on in my head saying, you got to do something, like itching to do something that, you didn't just survive that for nothing, because I thought I would go the route my father had, unfortunately. I mean, so many times when I had colectomy surgery, when I was diverted and given an ostomy again, after that wound vac thing in Mayo Clinic, I was just like, how am I surviving this? So after all of that, I was just like, I got to do something. I don't care what people think. And that's what the reality is. There is a phrase that, is used in Asian cultures. I've heard this is not just a South Asian thing, but in Hindi and Urdu, the phrase is log kya kahenge. What will people say? What will people think if they find out what you're about to tell them? And it is a method of silencing and shaming. Unfortunately, it was meant for good to uphold family respect and honor, but it is now used as a method of silencing and keeping things quiet and buried under the rug longer than it should be. And it prevents people from speaking out and being themselves. And I was like, I did not survive all that to not just be myself. And I started to locally help run support groups in New York, the women's support group, but also the co-ed one I've run, teen support group I've run. I started the teen support group with a few others, and I started a caregiver support group with a few others. And they were, hugely successful at the time. And, I still attend some of the support groups. And I think that's what empowered me to say, I'm not the only person going through this. And still, there were no South Asians in our support group, but there were a lot of other women who were saying they had loving relationships. And I thought for the longest time, this is just how it is. People are healthy if they're going to get married and stuff like that. This was ingrained in me. So imagine me coming into a support group, seeing women being treated as equals in their relationships and, being respected by their in-laws, even though they have this disease. And it was like this novel concept to me. It was like a light bulb went off in my head saying, Tina, oh my God, you need to be treated better than you have been. My husband's been extremely supportive and extremely kind to me throughout this entire process. And I'm very fortunate. But in general, people would say, like family friends would even say to me, you're really lucky you got married, or you're really lucky you have such a nice husband. I'm like, am I really? Like, is this how people look at this? And I still get these comments, by the way, as an advocate. And when I say the term social suicide, I think I knew that this would happen. And that's why my husband was scared too. Like, when I come out with a story like this, first of all, people are going to realize this was not just a small stomach ailment. I got so many questions like that. Like, oh, Tina, we thought this was just a small stomach ailment that you had. I was like, I wish. You really think I was in the hospital that many times or out on disability from work that many times, for a small stomach ailment? So I finally did come out with my story, and it truly was a coming out story, to be honest with you. So the New York chapter asked me to be their adult honored hero in 2018. And for that, in 2017, they had me write my story and they had me give speeches and things like that. And we did a lot of work together. And I finally shared it in front of 700 people at this Take Steps walk in 2018. And even before that, I think in January 2018, they released it on social media. And I was like, all right, that's it. I can't go back under the covers now. It's not happening. And I remember it was such a huge response. I got messages from various publications too, asking for my story. And that's where my blog came from, because people were asking me to write for them. And I was like, well, it's behind a paywall or this or that. And they're like, yeah, that's what you start a blog for and share on your blog for. And I was like, oh, and that's literally how my blog started. And I was like, I gotta think of a name. And it was Own Your Crohn's. It was a name that I had in mind since 2014, Own Your Crohn's, because I didn't know what else to do with my disease. I didn't know how else to be. And coming out meant owning my Crohn's. And so that's what happened. That's how Own Your Crohn's, my blog, started in 2018. And I'd say within 3 or 4 months, I started being asked for multiple speaking engagements. And I started working with pharma, but also nonprofits to write content for them, but also pharma to advise on clinical trial protocols. Having been in a clinical trial, what is acceptable to patients, also just advising on the entire process of going on medications and what patients go through, so that different companies could understand the patient experience from a patient advisor. So I started doing a lot of work like that. I was reached out to all the time over my blog, still am, for that reason. And I think about a year and a half ago, I started having another itch, probably a couple years ago. I was like, my Own Your Crohn's platform, yes, it represents minorities, minority health, but I need to do something more. I can't stop here. I really want patient advocacy to flourish and become very credible. And so I was like, I've got to start some kind of Facebook community, because I get tons of messages a day from South Asians around the world, and from Egyptians, from Middle Eastern people, from Far East, from South America, from Latin America, even from Nigeria and Tanzania. I would be getting messages from random parts of the world. And I was like, I just got to start a community or something. I can't respond to all these messages. It was just taking up so much of my time and brain power. And I was like, I need a team. So what happened was, there were a few girls that I had been talking to online, a few women in their 20s and early 30s who had been talking to online, who seemed to have quite a similar experience with cultural stigma and quite intense disease, unfortunately. We started something called IBD Desis, which means South Asians with IBD. Desi literally means of the mainland, of the South Asian mainland. So we started IBD Desis. It was first started as a Facebook community in January of 2021. And what we did with that was, we have about 1,200 people in our community now, a little over that. And it's South Asians from all over the world, but we're also making sure that we're allowing Middle Eastern folks and other folks from different countries to be able to join, because they face a lot of similar stigmas and they need a lot of credible information. And we basically share a lot of research with them, answer their questions, help them navigate the disease, help them navigate, okay, Remicade or Humira may not have worked out. What's another option? Are there combination therapies? Are there this and that? And not, in the realm of giving medical advice, but saying, can you ask your doctor what might be available? Is this available in your country? We've done a lot of research in different countries to be able to help patients understand, hey, can you ask your doctor about an enema if you're having all these rectal symptoms? Things like that patients in those countries may not know how to ask or what to ask. It's education I never had. It's education that some of these women never had. So we created the IBD Desis community to really help push out credible information in a private way so patients could feel comfortable asking. After about 3 or 4 months, we were like, this is so much bigger than just a Facebook community. So we went external in April 2021, and we started advocating externally by sharing various types of stories of people in our community, our own stories, not so much mine because I have my own platform, but for these other women, encourage them to share their stories, taught them how to, develop that elevated elevator pitch, how to tell their story in a way that was meaningful and understood by others, and also in a way that could empower others. So we worked a lot on that and sharing other people's stories, which was very challenging because there's so much stigma in our community. We would get anonymous posts. So we've done like anonymous poems, anonymous posts, things like that, just to get the word out there. And with that, there's been this trickling effect where there's been like one woman joined from Malaysia a few months ago, and she's like, oh, you guys are sharing your stories. Can we share mine? So we're going to be sharing hers pretty soon for her birthday. So it's like influencing patients to feel comfortable enough to share their stories and start speaking up and advocating for themselves in that regard. So that's IBD Daisies. Within a few months of the external platform, July of 2021 rolls around. And I'm like, girls, we got to go big or we got to go home. And they're like, what do you want to do now? And I'm like, if we really want to start changing things, we really need to approach nonprofit status. And I really think that this has to be bigger than us, that patient advocacy is one sort of piece of this. But the other piece of this is we need research for our community and we need professionals who understand the disease. I think I told you early on in my journey that I was not diagnosed correctly and that it took a long time to find an IBD specialized physician, which was unheard of back then. And even till today, people don't know to do that. In other countries, there's just general gastroenterologists. There's no IBD specialized physician. So what we did was I was like, we need to advance research and we need to make sure there's professional development in addition to patient advocacy. That's how SIO was born, South Asian IBD Alliance. We approached several doctor contacts that I had in the community to see if there would be interest in forming a nonprofit alliance. And we really took a leap of faith and they took a leap of faith, trusting in me. I've worked with many of them before, but even some of them I haven't. And they were like, this is an excellent idea. We have seen this so much and it's under wraps. You've been public about it. A few of these girls have been public about it, but in general, no one's talking about it. And we want to change that with you all. So that's how SIO was born. The South Asian IBD Alliance is the first patient and clinician-led nonprofit in the community. There is a doctor by the name of Dr. Deepak Parakal at Washington University in St. Louis. He and I run SIA together. I'm the president, he's the vice president, and we have a bunch of patient advocates from around the world on the board, from the UK and India, and we have a bunch of IBD specialists, but also an IBD specialized dietitian, Neha Shah, on the board. So we have a number of people sort of working with us, and the two of the patient advocates on the board are co-secretaries in running the org. Neha is the treasurer and sort of the director of operations, and we have Dr. Shaji Sebastian in the UK and Dr. Vishal Sharma in India running research. We have Dr. Tausif Ali from Pakistan, who's now in the United States, along with Dr. Kiran Pedi in India running professional development. And we have developed all sorts of resources for India and Pakistan to train some GIs and primary care physicians on IBD and understanding IBD and diagnosing it and differentiating between other diagnoses that are endemic to South Asia, such as tuberculosis, which is often mixed up with Crohn's disease. Then we have patient outreach and advocacy, which is run by those two patient advocates who are co-secretaries, Sharon Kela and Mother Abala Subramaniam, and Dr. Neil Nandi from Penn is helping to run that, and a doctor from India named Dr. Sumit Bhatia. So we have a number of physicians involved. We also have a physician who writes our grants and does our partnership work. His name is Dr. Srinivas Bishu in Michigan. So really we're spread out all over the world, and we're all very, very passionate about changing this rhetoric and this cultural stigma, because we see and we live it and we hear it every day. They hear it as clinicians. Neha hears it as a dietitian, thinking that this is a diet and lifestyle disease. And we, of course, have experienced it as patients. So we've all come together as an alliance to push forward three different major goals: research, professional development, and patient outreach and advocacy. So IBD Daisies is now a part of patient outreach and advocacy within SIA.
That's so cool. So I'm curious about your growth and like the people getting involved, because SIA has not been around that long. How have you seen it grow in the time, even this short time that it's been around?
That's a great question, Alicia. It's grown quite a bit. Initially, we weren't sure if it would get off the ground, and we were like, this was an experiment just to see if things would work out. Honestly, there's been such a phenomenal response and growth and followership and people reaching out. I will tell you, there are patients reaching out from the Maldives. I'm not even kidding. It's a small island off the coast of India. And one of them was literally told in the Maldives that she's the first patient diagnosed with Crohn's. And then we got another one. So I'm just sharing that, like, they reached out saying, you know, we found so many accounts for IBD, and then we finally found you. And we couldn't relate to those IBD accounts in the same way that we can relate to the stories that you're sharing. And now we want to share too. So we've gotten a lot of that. And not just from the patient side, but from the physician side, it's like, oh my God, finally, we're doing something like this. We met at DDW this past year in San Diego. A lot of clinicians showed up to our happy hour and they were like, finally, somebody is doing something about this. I'm just going to put out there, Alicia and Robin, one thing. In 2010, US numbers of IBD were 1.6 million. The numbers as of 2010 in India, and they have not been calculated since, were 1.4 million, right behind the United States. Nobody's talking about this.
Holy cow.
That's epidemiological data. And that's people who have sought a diagnosis and treatment. Okay, that's not the people who are hidden behind closed doors due to shame, who are not allowed to pursue treatment or are suffering in silence and shame. That's just India. There's 8 countries in South Asia. There's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Bhutan, Nepal, and Afghanistan. And I'm just telling you right now, we've helped patients in Afghanistan during the crisis last summer get medication, get doctor's visits out of India. There's a lot of medical tourism in India. India does not have access to half the biologics and medications we have here. Yet people from Iraq, Iran, from Pakistan, from other countries, including Bangladesh, are going into India to get access to care. If we don't help them get this medication access and access to clinical trials, it's a huge loss for the community, because I'm going to tell you, EFCA, the European Federation for Crohn's and Colitis, has stated that current numbers of IBD are 10 million that are known around the world. How much of that is India if it was 1.4 million in 2010?
Yeah, that's
and America's at 3.1 million right now. So what are we looking at? And that's just one of 8 countries that we know of. The numbers have not been calculated anywhere else if people are even seeking a diagnosis. And I'm just going to put that out there. That's just the mainland of South Asia. Now, mind you, there's been multiple studies showing that when people migrate from the Far East, from the Southeast, the Middle East, South America, wherever, to the West, they're developing IBD. Mind you, the diaspora has huge numbers that have never been calculated. And I will share this as well. The way that our demographics are broken down in the United States is not accurate. They label us as Asian Pacific Islander. That's 60% of the world. Do we really know who has IBD and like how severe it is in South Asians versus Middle Easterners versus Americans? We don't know any of that. And they want diversity in clinical trials, but how do we even begin to achieve that if we're not breaking down demographic data properly? That's part of SAIA's mission and goal, is to make sure we're getting help for patients in South Asia, yes, but also in the diaspora, because there's people like me here who I've heard from who will not pursue biologics, who will delay surgery, end up 85 pounds like me, and have no support system. That's the truth, and that's reality. People often reach out to me, Alicia and Robin, saying, can somebody from the IBD Bases team in America speak at an event? I'm like, do you know what you're asking? We can't even share our stories publicly in writing, let alone speak at a public event. It's very, very hard for us to do that. And it's very, very challenging. And I will tell you, it's extremely rewarding when we do, but I don't want to speak for the entire community, but I will say for many of us, it's extremely challenging.
And I think that's why it's so important that you create this organization, because collectively you can share data, you can share some people's experience who are willing to be open about it, but even just simply the cultural nuances that other providers need to understand as they're approaching a conversation with their patients that may come from a South Asian background. Even if your family's been here for generations and generations, there's still that layer of culture that's involved with everything. Absolutely. So, even talking to somebody about surgery or biologics or injectables, that there is the stigma attached to it, to be able to say, okay, this is why this is happening. This is why I'm recommending it, and adding in that just sensitivity that goes along with having that conversation with somebody, and perhaps having to have the conversation with their spouse and their mom and their dad and other people in their family.
It's literally a coming out journey, Alicia. I will definitely say that. And I will add a tidbit here. I am working with Dr. Tiffany Taft and a colleague of hers, Dr. Anjali Pandit, and I've gotten the patient advocate advocate from India, Madhura, involved in this. But Dr. Taft announced on Twitter that of the South Asian patients from around the world that we recruited, her statistics are showing that they have 5.5 times greater risk of medical post-traumatic stress than white counterparts. And that's a massive number. It's never been studied before. It's groundbreaking, and it needs to be studied further. We need to understand why. And if I were to put a guess on that, just from my own experience, because I was a part of that survey too, it would be the cultural stigmas. It would be that log kya kahenge factor, that you can't come out with this and be yourself. And there's a whole chunk of your life hidden away under the rug because you don't want to bring shame upon your family. And that includes seeking a diagnosis or treatment.
Yeah. Friend of the show, Tiffany. I mean, it really, her research is mind blowing in so many ways. And she acknowledged that, you know, a lot of the existing data that's out there doesn't necessarily distill down into specific communities and how we need to do that, because what she was looking at, the research that did look at the demographics of the people that she was talking to, it looked like, I know the one she referenced on our podcast was for folks from the Black, African American, and Latino communities, that they were at an enormous risk of post-traumatic stress for their inflammatory bowel disease. And so this, unfortunately, it doesn't surprise me to hear that this is also high in the South Asian community, but that means we need more research into this, because why is this happening? What are the cultural layers that need to come into this? But also, what is the medical community do we need to do differently to make sure that we're minimizing this risk as much as possible? Unfortunately, I think because of the nature of these diseases, there's going to be trauma that happens with it.
Of course.
But what
but
can
how
you
do
do
we
to
minimize it? Exactly.
Yeah. It's like, what conversations can you have ahead of time? How can you prepare people for this? How can you prepare your medical students and your fellows to make sure that they're not bringing this forward? So I think it's really, really important. I'm so excited for you guys to have already made this much progress.
I really appreciate that, Alicia. Like, I will say you hit the nail on the head when you say that providers need to understand this. I will tell you, my first GI doctor, the one who really helped me get into surgery and things like that, he was of Latino descent, and he didn't even quite get what was going on with my family. And he's like, I get it, but at the same time, Tina, like, this is life or death. But everything is based on family reputation. It's not based on individuals. You sacrifice everything for family in our culture. And there is that kind of respect for elders. You do what your elders say. So it was always a tug of war between my doctor and my elders. And that's what I need physicians to understand. And when you talk about cultural competence, that's a huge part of this. There was a study done by Dr. Shaji Sebastian on our team a few years ago, I think in June of 2020, out of the UK, talking about, I think it was 19 or 20 points on which South Asians were really struggling with the cultural stigma in the South Asian British community. And he and a team member of mine, Sharon, and some other folks on SIA, a dietitian and an IBD nurse, Mother Ramdeen, are getting together to do a talk next week, actually, for South Asian Heritage Month. They have a Heritage Month in the UK for South Asians, and they're actually getting together to talk about bowel habits and when to seek help just next week as patients and clinicians with Guts UK and with another nonprofit called Chronically Brown that are all working towards, you know, minimizing the disparities in the South Asian community living with bowel conditions. So I'm really excited for SIA to be a part of that, and cultural competence is going to be and is super huge right now. Whether you're a dietitian, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a doctor or a psychologist, people really need to understand the diverse melting pot that we will live in and the healthcare disparities that are happening and the trauma that's taking place. Even though it might be inadvertent, it's happening because there's a lack of that cultural awareness and sensitivity.
I could see how especially diet would be high on that list. I mean,
diet's high on that list.
Food is just wrapped into everybody's culture in such a deep way that if you can't eat what's being served and if it's traditional, you get a lot of, frankly, pardon my friend, was just a lot of shit from your family. You know, they're going to push back. They're going to be upset. And I do feel like that's been minimized in our community as well. It's like, oh, well, you know, we just got to get you well. The diet will come, the diet will figure it out. But like, it's such an important piece of people's socialization and their culture. And so we need to layer that in with all of this too.
I would just have to say that food-related quality of life is an important part of quality of life in any bowel disease, in any gut-related disease, because even though they they might say, it's not hurting you necessarily in IBD, but then there's so many emulsifiers and so many preservatives and carrageenan that are all linked to IBD somehow, microplastics even. All this stuff's in our food. So yes, there is a diet component to this. How can we eat clean without setting off our symptoms? I'm plant-based. I do eat a little bit of dairy and cheese here and there, and ghee, which is a big part of Indian culture. I do have some of that stuff, but the reality is I have to blend and pulverize my food because I can't tolerate these huge pieces of broccoli or spinach. So I find creative ways to eat. But guess who helped me get there? My dietitian, who is culturally competent in New York. She's not Indian, but she is aware, and she has tons of South Asian patients and patients of other, ethnicities. So I'm very fortunate in that regard. And my mother has helped me a ton. She's been very accepting that my diet has had to change. She's come a long way with my journey and accepting my ostomy and accepting that I need to be on medication. My mother has really, really helped me with coming up with creative ways for me to eat so that I could still enjoy food. I could still go out to eat, but eat things that, will still satisfy me, but not be completely toxic to my gut either. We have to realize that we have to give ourselves some grace here too. Sometimes we'll try something and it will set us off like none other. But I want us to look at that as not a failure, but a win. We tried something new. It didn't work out. We learned from it. And that's the reality of food. We have a love-hate relationship with food, but honestly, we can find creative ways to enjoy food again. It takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of mindset in the sense that I can do this. I can get through this.
I think it's important you pointed that out because several of our guests have in the past have talked about RFID, including Tiffany, which is restrictive food intake disorder, which, we don't want to add another disorder onto people, but it is common in the IBD community to restrict because food is scary and it hurts. And so, it is challenging to be brave enough to bring these foods back in and to risk being symptomatic the next day just to try it. So I think I'm glad that you brought that up. You mentioned pelvic floor disorder, and we have had a really fantastic pelvic floor therapist on already. I'm curious about your experiences with pelvic floor and, just also from that cultural lens, is this something that has been accepted? Have you gotten pushback on that as well?
That's a great question about pelvic floor dysfunction. The reason why I started going for pelvic floor physical therapy is because I actually had a peritoneal inclusion cyst, which is a cyst that was born of scar tissue that accumulated fluid back in 2016. And it was impinging on my bladder. And I've told you that my bladder was sort of tethering onto my bowel and just huge problems. So my whole reason for going into pelvic floor therapy was based on that, to sort of fix my bladder type issues because I was constantly peeing and having what felt like urinary distress and constant UTIs, even though they were not growing anything in urinary culture. So there's no bacteria growing. That's a prime sign of pelvic floor dysfunction, is when you feel like you have an UTI, but it's not actually a UTI. So my gynecologist, when I told her that, she's like, you need pelvic floor physical therapy. She sent me to someone in New York. The problem with pelvic floor physical therapy, at least in New York that I'm aware of, it tends to be out of network. So you need really good insurance benefits, at least here, to get access to it. And so pelvic floor therapy has been extremely critical for my care. And I can't emphasize that enough. There is a lot of stigma associated with it. It was very challenging for me to start talking about sexuality, intimacy, pelvic floor dysfunction. But I was like, hey, I've already opened up about wound vacs and fistulae. What else is left? So I do talk about these things. And I actually was interviewed by Giddy, like a pretty large sexual health platform that also talks about pelvic floor dysfunction and just sex and diarrhea, sex and constipation, all this stuff. Pelvic floor dysfunction, I did not even know what this was until my gyne sent me to the physical therapist. And that's when my learning journey began. I thought it was very awkward because there's a lot of internal work. By internal, I mean they can do vaginal and they can do rectal. I started to see a pelvic floor physiatrist too, along with that, which is very specialized. And she was Pakistani. And I was sent to her by my physical therapist. And she started giving me injections to my pelvic floor to help with the chronic pain. So instead of taking oral meds, narcotics that would give me constipation and other side effects, she started giving me injections that were monitored by her. And usually I go twice a year for a few injections now. And that helps with the healing and allows the PT to work even better. I would say that this has been life-changing for me because a lot of my flare-ups were getting mixed up with pelvic floor dysfunction. A lot of the pain was similar. I've heard this from other patients too, that the pain tends to be similar, and our peeing and pooping, evacuation gets really affected, especially by surgery, but also by IBD flare-ups. These organs are in close proximity, and our pelvic floor becomes quite weak from what I understand, having all these flare-ups, being on the toilet all the time. Yeah, Robin's raising her hand, so I know she gets it. And I did not realize at the time that I started pelvic floor PT that this was going to benefit my bowels in so many ways, and that this was for IBS as well as IBD. It's more well known for IBS, but I really think IBD physicians ought to learn about pelvic floor physical therapy and send their patients. I'll be really very clear and honest with you about this. So coming back from my surgery in Pittsburgh in November, a month or about 5 weeks later, I started pelvic floor PT again. I'm walking 6,000 to 10,000 steps a day in New York City. I'm using an elliptical. I am lifting weights. I'm no bodybuilder, okay? But the mental health component of being able to exercise again after a massive laparotomy at the age of 38, like I never thought that would be possible, but my pelvic floor physical therapist made it possible. My core moves. I can do diaphragmatic breathing. I can do all sorts of ridiculous spinal twists and exercises that I never thought I could do after such a massive surgery. And here we are. So I cannot emphasize the benefits of pelvic floor therapy and even those injections that I get from the physiatrist to manage this. Those injections are horribly painful. They go into my vagina and into my bottom where I have a lot of scarring from the wound vac, but I am not on chronic pain meds after all those surgeries. So I'm just putting it out there that managing your pelvic floor, I think, is vital, especially if you've had significant flare-ups, moderate to severe disease. I mean, I'm not giving out medical advice here at all, but this is something that I really think patients need to talk to their physicians about, that it shouldn't just be gynecologists prescribing this, that patients after surgery, even before surgery, should be set up so that their recovery can go a little bit smoother and so that they can build up again in a way that's much more resilient for their bodies.
Well, I think that we normalize that part of it. And for me, I have 2 babies. Well, they're not babies anymore, but they're
your
my
babies.
They're my babies.
They're your babies.
But I got diagnosed like when my youngest was a year old, but you have incontinence from having babies. You deliver vaginally, you have incontinence. And then I have surgery, major surgery a year later to have my colon removed. And I have all of the scar tissue, which I don't know or understand. And so when I finally went to a pelvic floor physical therapist this calendar year for the first time in 20 plus years of all of this, she's like, your pelvic floor muscles are like frozen. Like there's no muscle tone there. Like there's no movement at all. Yeah. And so, I mean, you can only say that you have urinary incontinence from having a baby for so long. 20 years later, you can't say that the urinary incontinence is caused from a vaginal delivery, but you normalize it. You know what I'm saying? Like just all of these things happen and you just normalize it and normalize it and normalize it. And then you have painful sex for 20 years, but you think that that's just, that's how it is because you had surgery and that's your life now. And I have to find a new one closer to me. So I haven't done that since that visit, but just what she gave me already is significantly impacting, you know, my well-being. So I can't wait to get to see one regularly.
I will also tell you this, the physiatrist that I see, and I think that this is mind-blowing and needs to be considered much more so potentially for even IBD and IBDS patients, she prescribes Valium, baclofen suppositories vaginally and even rectally for patients like me. Obviously, my rectum's closed. I have Barbie butt now, but I have used that after flights and it has completely numbed out the area so that I don't have tons of pain. Can you imagine how groundbreaking this could be for patients with tons of rectal pain? Why is this not being explored by IBDologists?
I'm like a little angry right now with you saying that.
I'm sorry.
I mean, but honestly, how many of us have just unmanageable? I mean, how many times did I lay on the floor in the bathroom, like in tears in the fetal position because of the amount of pain I was experiencing rectally?
Valium takes the edge off that pain. Does it make me fall asleep? Do I have some systemic effect? Sure. I don't use it that often. It's usually after flights or train rides, long ones, especially international across the country, especially for someone like you who's traveling a lot. And the baclofen prevents the spasming. I mean, I don't know why they're not working together. I don't know why this is not coordinated, if it's a taboo subject for IBD specialists or what it is. But I really think more of our patients need a lot of help on that front. And I will continue to speak about it. So I'm very glad you asked about that, because it's top of my list in terms of importance for care. You know, I've been hearing a lot these days on Twitter and otherwise, people saying, you know, the medications aren't doing enough. We need a cure. I agree. We need a cure, but we also need therapeutics like this that sort of integrate into the medication experience, whether that's diet, whether that's pelvic floor physical therapy, whether that's mental health therapy. All of these things create wellness. We are not just going to get treated for IBD with a medication or two. We need the big whole entire picture to come together in order to have wellness. That's the way I look at IBD. So we can talk about cures. We keep working towards those. I'm all for it. And I especially want it. But to be honest with you, for those of us who've had so much surgery or beyond that cure stage, I have to live knowing that I can get wellness somehow. And that's how I do it. I approach it in all these ways.
Yes, if there was a cure for Crohn's disease tomorrow, you would 100% take it, but that doesn't take away the scar tissue and the existing damage that's already there that still needs to be addressed in order to improve your quality of life and your wellness. I'm glad you brought that up.
I will just say that remission's not a cure, but we have to look at the bigger picture. Remission is not just the medication. It's getting everything else on track too. And that's truly how I feel. And I'm one of those patients that even if there's a cure, there's been so much manipulation done to my bowels that the cure doesn't affect me. I need medications, but I also need to approach this from a holistic perspective with my mental health therapist, with my dietitian. I go for acupuncture, which really helps with a lot of motility issues and sinus issues. And then I also go for pelvic floor physical therapy. That is my wellness picture.
I want to ask you about the acupuncture, because when I was feeling the best that I have ever felt was after I had been doing acupuncture. I felt so much better when I was having it done regularly.
I'm so glad to hear that, Robin. So my acupuncture journey started about 4 years ago. And what happened is I started seeing an integrative specialist here in New York. I felt comfortable seeing like a practitioner who had her MD, but also understood functional medicine, also understood the holistic aspects. She acknowledges the role of surgery and the role of medication. That's not the issue, but she'll also tell me which supplements I need. She'll also tell me about which alternative practices I should consider. And acupuncture was the top of her list 4 years ago for me. I was really suffering from allergies and sinus issues that I had developed in a previous New York City apartment from asbestos exposure and from exposure to mold. I have asthma now and I have sinusitis and pretty severe allergies. And I started seeing her to sort of get some of that under control. Plus I was having a lot of constipation. I think what attracted me to her is the fact that she has both backgrounds, that she's an MD, a primary care physician, but that she also understands all kinds of other, medication techniques and alternative medicine techniques. She's an acupuncturist by trade, but she also has many trained acupuncturists in her office. And she sent me to the one that she thought would be best for me. That acupuncturist, lovely woman, she works on my sinuses. I literally don't really get migraines anymore. I used to get them all the time. So it's been great for stress relief, which I think is extremely important when you have chronic illness. And I think perhaps migraines might have been related to stress. I don't get vertigo or migraines anymore. So she's really helped on those fronts as far as minimizing the symptoms. But the other thing that she's really helped me with is my TMJ. She's really helped with that, and my motility issues. So she gets things moving. Like there's an energy with acupuncture called chi. So when there's a lot of gas or bloating, things like that, she gets it moving and it comes out. And the beauty of it, and I'm sorry if this is TMI, because I have an ostomy bag, literally at the end of the session, you can see that things are moving and all this gas has come out. Like you can see that every single time. Because it's helped me so much with, motility and sinus and headaches and all that kind of stuff, I definitely do find that there is a role for acupuncture and wellness. I think IBD is probably too complicated and severe of a disease to really have have tons of benefit from acupuncture. It's certainly not a treatment option, but I do think it's a complementary option that can really help with wellness.
Obviously, like you said, IBD is complicated and it's not something that helps with that, but my extraintestinal manifestation is joint pain. And then when I went one time when I was having a migraine, and she's like, oh, I can fix that for you too. So,
and she did, right?
Yeah, and she did. Yes. And my acupuncturist, also an MD, she was a practicing acupuncturist. Yeah. So it was amazing. I'm getting a little nostalgic. Like, I can't wait to find somebody again.
With IBD, I'm just going to put this out there, and I'm glad Robin brought this up. There are so many extraintestinal manifestations. There's so many things outside of the gut that we have to manage, that I feel like if we can do things that our doctors approve of and prescribe that can promote sort of healing on other fronts, it's really important for the big picture, because IBD is not just a bowel disease.
Very, very true. Tina, I'm really sad to tell you that we've been talking for much longer than I anticipated.
I just noticed.
This is going to be a supersized episode, which is going to be fun. But so we're going to ask you one last question. What is one piece of advice you give to our IBD community?
One piece of advice that I would give to our IBD community is to not lose hope, to be sort of the change that we wish to see. And I'm not here to promote medication or alternative therapy or any way of life. I'm here to say that if we truly want change for our community, we've got to be the change that we wish to see. Whether that means becoming an advocate, starting to share your story, whether that means joining a clinical trial, joining clinical research studies to really push along understanding of IBD, we should be doing what it takes to bring about that change, and not just hoping that someone else should do it for us. I truly believe that if we want to see IBD move by leaps and bounds, which it already has done in the last 30 years since my father went through it, that we too have to carry that torch forward for future generations. So that would be my one piece of advice. Don't lose hope and be the change you wish to see in this community.
That is the perfect way to end. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story with us.
Yes.
Oh, your Miralax glass is empty. Good for you.
It's empty. Yeah. There's like this teeny bit left.
Okay.
Well, cheers with that. I've only got a little bit of wine left too.
Me too. I've only got a little bit left.
Cheers
to you joining us, and cheers to the rest of our community for joining us as well. So thank you guys so much for joining us for Bowel Moments. If you liked this episode, please rate, review, subscribe, and even better, share it with your friends. Cheers.